Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Now, I know that this has been one of the most anticipated sessions of this conference because everyone has been coming to me and saying, "Oh, you're interviewing Karen. I've got questions for you." So there's a lot of interest, Karen, in what you're saying. But before we start, I would like to make an announcement. Some personal news. I have recently been elected as street captain of my street in Linden, a suburb of Johannesburg, South Africa. Now, this is a very important job. When someone's cat goes missing, I have to coordinate the search. When the power goes out, I have to liaise with the power companies. And when the neighborhood wants to put up surveillance cameras outside my front door on a pole with 3 or 4 little cameras at the top, I have to coordinate the residents' response. And when I'm doing that, I'm thinking about an article that Karen wrote a few years ago for the MIT Technology Review about digital apartheid in South Africa and how these new technologies that are being introduced are being used to create invisible walls in places in South Africa that used to have physical walls. Those physical walls have come down, and now we are putting up new walls. And understanding how the new walls work, understanding who's building them, is one of the most pressing journalistic issues of this particular moment in history, and I cannot think of anyone better to talk us through it than Karen. So welcome, Karen. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to begin by talking about metaphors. The empire of AI is a very powerful metaphor. Where did it come from?
So it starts a little bit where you just left off when I was doing that story in South Africa, but it actually started a bit earlier than that. So I started covering AI full-time as a reporter in 2018 for MIT Technology Review. And at that time, there was already quite a lot of conversation within academia, within the research space, about whether or not this technology, which actually stems from the 1950s, had really borne out all of its promises. All the way back, starting in the 1950s, there was already a lot of hype around this technology and this idea that somehow going to deliver us to utopia. But in the 2016 to 2018 period was when AI started leaving the lab and going into the real world, and it started being used in recommendation systems for social media. It started being used for ad targeting and for other things like that. And we started seeing the ways that these systems could actually amplify historic inequities rather than bring us to some kind of different and more modern state. And there were a group of scholars in the UK at the time and one in the US that were beginning to explore the parallels between the way that the AI industry was deploying its technologies and developing it and the history of colonialism. And I became really obsessed with this idea that somehow this technology that is supposed to bring us modernity is actually doing exactly the opposite. And so I embarked on this project called AI Colonialism. It was a 4-part series for MIT Technology Review that brought me to places like South Africa to look at whether or not this theoretical framework that academics had developed was actually playing out in the real world on the ground. And the story that I was doing in Johannesburg was looking at the way that all of these surveillance companies from all around the world, American companies, Chinese companies, were flooding the South African market with their products at a time when they were being criticized for their facial recognition technologies not accurately identifying Black faces. And so there was this very real situation where they were trying to tap into this market, harvest the data of Black bodies to improve their surveillance systems, and simultaneously the deployment of these technologies was creating this digital apartheid as told to me by civil rights activists on the ground. And that was one of 4 stories that really consolidated and illustrated this idea in my mind that we really are beginning to see these historical patterns repeat themselves. And so I then started thinking about whether or not to write a book on this subject. And it was during the process of working on a proposal about AI colonialism that then ChatGPT suddenly launched. And my literary agent at the time was asking me, well, does this fix the problem? Because, post ChatGPT, it feels like everything has changed. The AI conversation has suddenly changed. Does it make all of these problems that you're talking about better? And I was like, absolutely not. It makes it so much worse. And he was like, well, then that is your book.
And then tell us about the process of writing the book. I mean, it's a wonderful read if you haven't read it. And it is filled with so many interviews. You clearly spoke to a lot of people inside the companies that you were reporting on. How easy was it to get access to those people? How willing were they to talk about the potential pitfalls of these technologies that they are in fact developing?
So I initially thought that it would be incredibly hard to get access to these people because of my personal history with OpenAI. I was the first journalist to profile them back in 2020 while I was at MIT Technology Review. And the reason I even identified the company as an interesting entity to profile in the first place was because at the time they conceived of themselves as a fundamental AI research lab that did not care about commercialization, did not want to create consumer products. And MIT Tech Review is it's a publication that really focuses on that cutting edge fundamental research. And we used to say that if the technology is commercialized, then it's actually too late for us to cover it. And so I was the junior AI reporter at the organization. There was also a senior AI reporter. And OpenAI was just important enough to warrant a profile, but not so important to give to the senior AI reporter. So that's why I ended up being, in this particular place, in a particular moment, at the right place at the right time, where I embedded within the organization for 3 days at a very pivotal moment of the company's history, when it had just actually reformed itself as a company. It actually started as a nonprofit before it embarked on the journey that manifests in the company that we know today. And when that profile came out in 2020, I was quite critical of the company. I basically pointed out that there was a huge discrepancy between the way that it sold itself narratively to the public as this very mission-driven organization that didn't want to commercialize anything, that was doing everything in the public interest with full transparency, and how it actually operated behind the closed doors, which is that they in fact secretly had this really big commercialization plan, and they were the most opaque organization that I had ever covered as a tech reporter. And so they really, really didn't like me, and they decided to completely ice me out from any future interactions. And they would only ever speak to the senior AI reporter at the organization because, as they told him once in an email, we have a history with Karen and we're never going to speak to her again. And so when I started on this book project to report what was going on within the company, I thought it's very well possible that I am just going to have to report from the outside and tell the story from the outside rather than actually get the inside details, because no one at the organization is actually going to speak to a reporter that was branded early on in the company's history as terrible. And it turned out that when I started reaching out, I opened up LinkedIn and I just created a giant spreadsheet of every single person that had ever worked at the company and started looking for their contact information. And as I just started reaching out to anyone that I could find, I realized that a significant number of them, in fact, were very keen to talk to me specifically because they thought that my profile had been incredibly accurate and that I had successfully gotten underneath the headlines, and I had really told the actual story of what was happening within the company. And they also thought I was pretty fair, even though I was criticizing the way that the company had turned. They had those same doubts and those same criticisms, and they resonated with the critique. And so there was a category of people that was actually really easy to, I didn't have to persuade them at all. They simply just opened up their trust to me and opened up their notes, their documents, their photos, and started telling me the story of the company. And then, of course, there were other people who it took a little bit of time to really persuade them that this was a worthwhile project to be part of. But the way that I did that was kind of twofold. One was a lot of people were very genuinely scared of participating in a project like this because I never hid the fact that it was going to be a critical book. I was going to be quite hard-hitting on the track record that the company had. And so first and foremost, I always really emphasize that I would prioritize their safety above all, and I would walk them through my protocols for anonymizing them, how to keep the interviews and the data that they gave me secure. And I always gave them the option, like any time before the manuscript has closed, you can decide at any moment to not participate anymore, and I'll pull everything that you ever told me out of the book. And the second thing that I used to persuade them was to really appeal to the mission that they came to the company for. Many of the people that worked at OpenAI through its history were driven by this idea of AI is going to be a fundamentally consequential technology. We need to think carefully about how it is governed. And I would tell them, like that is ultimately the beating heart of the book as well. Like I'm asking the same question, and the only way I think we can arrive at a good answer for this is if we are transparent with the public about exactly how decisions were made within the company, exactly what happened, so that it's in the public record. And a lot of people ultimately felt that that was a worthwhile endeavor. Even if they had a good experience at the company, they still felt that it was important to have that in the public domain.
And what I found to be some of the most interesting parts of the book were not about the tech itself, but about the ideologies and the beliefs of the people creating the tech. Can you talk us through a little bit of what you found, what came through in your interviews?
The thing that surprised me the most when I was working on the book is the degree to which there are quasi-religious movements that have developed within Silicon Valley. I say quasi-religious, but frankly, they're just religious. And my background is I studied engineering at MIT, and then I worked in the tech industry. So many of my friends from college are still living in San Francisco, working in the tech industry. So I'm very intimately familiar with the culture there, and I was still shocked that it had dramatically transformed into this much more religious turn after 10 years of not being part of that space. And the religion, what I describe, it's a religion of AGI, artificial general intelligence. It's this belief that there is a theoretical AI system that can be built one day that will embody everything that it means to be human, including potentially consciousness. And when we essentially effectively recreate human intelligence in machines, it will have some cataclysmic transformation on society, because this will be the first time that our intelligent capabilities are somehow perfectly replicable in a digital entity. And you no longer have to wait for the slow process of humans to have children and raise their children in order to just rapidly proliferate intelligence all around the universe. And so there's two camps of this religion. They're colloquially called the boomers and the doomers. And the boomers believe that the cataclysmic shift will be positive. We will end up in a paradise, because the key challenge to solving all of the problems that we face in the universe right now is a shortage of intelligence. And so if we finally get this abundance of intelligence, we're going to cure cancer, solve climate change, eradicate poverty, and all will be well, and we'll stop having wars, and there will be peace. And then there's the doomers who think the exact opposite, that we could go in exactly the opposite direction. These digital intelligent species will actually overcome us. We will be unable to control it. The first thing they will do is want to kill off all humans, and then it will be existential risk for all of us. And it's just like, I cannot stress enough that these are belief systems. They're not backed in any kind of scientific evidence or data, and the people who believe it also recognize that. They actually call themselves believers. They say that they are AGI pilled. They use this vocabulary that fully recognizes that there isn't actually any kind of scientific way to substantiate what their ideologies are, but they use these ideologies to drive all of their decision making. So they think that all of the problems that stem from the approach to how Silicon Valley is developing AI right now are inconsequential compared to the potential cataclysmic shift that would arrive if they actually reach this inflection point. So, there's been massive protests in the last year over the rapid proliferation of data centers all around the world, because these data centers are deeply environmentally harmful. They are deeply harmful to public health of communities. They hike up people's utility bills. They lead to an exacerbation of the affordability crisis. And for many people in the Bay Area that are part of this AGI belief system, they just think that this is going to be a blip. Like, it doesn't actually matter that there's all of this scaled harm happening right now, because when we reach utopia, AGI is going to help us figure out how to solve all the problems that these communities are facing. Or if they're part of the doomer camp, like, they must continue to build AGI faster than the evil guys, because otherwise all of humanity is going to die, so it doesn't matter anyway. So it is this very deeply, anti-humanistic, anti-human agency ideology that drives so much of the AI industry's development, because in their minds, this path that they are taking us on is entirely inevitable, entirely out of their control, but justifies why they should be the tiny group at the top, really shaping and manifesting this trajectory of AI development.
I know that Elon Musk is not the subject of much of your reporting, but he's been in the news recently, as he often is. But this time, it feels like he's making steps along that path, in terms of, there's a vision to send 1 million people to Mars, becoming the first trillionaire in history, launching on the stock exchange. And what we're seeing is all of this money being put into supporting these ambitions. Now, I am a white South African, so is Elon Musk, as much as he would like to forget it. And one thing that I know I can recognize when I see it is white supremacy. And it certainly feels like there's a healthy strand of that running through Silicon Valley at the moment. And it's being supported by the pension funds of most of America, from what we can tell from outside. So how do we combat this? If we don't have access to the money or the tech, what role can people not inside this bubble play?
Yeah. Before I get to what we should do, one of the things that I think helps describe the ideologies of this collection of people further is this phrase that Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor co-authored called "End Times Fascism." And they have a Guardian article about this particular phrase and how they think it actually describes, not just the tech elite, but also other types of phenomenon that we are seeing around the world, around this like frenetic, these prophecies that the end times are coming, and therefore we must do something in response to that, and like build bunkers, whether it's like literal bunkers or fortresses, create a fortress around our country, and this rise of nationalism and so on and so forth, which I think they have a book coming out later this year that I was able to read an early copy of, and it's just absolutely phenomenal. And basically the center of what they identify is part of this end times fascism ideology is this belief that the world as we know it is fundamentally coming to an end, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so if that is the case, climate change is already here. There's nothing we can do to stop it anymore. AI, superintelligence is on the horizon. There's nothing we can do to stop it anymore. They end up acting in this way of there will be profound losers in this ending of the current phase of our universe. So let's just make sure that we are not part of it. And we'll do everything in our power to exit to Mars, to build our bunkers, to be the ones that create the superintelligence. So at the very least, the superintelligence listens to us. And I just think it's such an important naming of what is actually going on here. They understand that they are accelerating our demise, and they're doing it on purpose because it is part of the plot for then allowing them as to be the sole kind of survivors of everything that they're engaged in. And so to go to your question then of facing the scary ideology, what do we do about it? There's been this really remarkable phenomenon that's happened over the past year, which is this incredible blossoming of resistance all around the world against the AI industry and against, all intersecting forms of end times fascism. But I'll focus on the AI industry in particular. The data center resistance is one of them. there have been, a number of lawsuits, many, many, many lawsuits that have been levied at these companies as a way to use litigation as a lever of accountability towards these companies. There has been a significant amount of worker organizing that has happened, whether that's the Hollywood writer strikes or recently in California, there was also mental health worker strikes. There's been strikes from like animation guilds in Japan and voice actors in Latin America, all also engaging in holding this industry, the AI industry, and their own industries accountable in preventing AI development from going the particular direction that Silicon Valley wants it to. And it is having actually a profound effect on the way that the AI industry is able to continue plotting down this path. In 2025, over $150 billion of data center projects were stalled, I think in just the US alone. And OpenAI, in a couple months ago, they had to shutter their video generation tool Sora, which when it originally launched, they fashioned as the second most important tech product launch since ChatGPT. And it met a very untimely demise, in part because of several factors that were all shaped by this grassroots action. The first factor was that they're incredibly constrained in their data center resources. And when you look at all the projects that have been stalled, there have been a number of them that are, in fact, OpenAI facilities that have been stalled. The second factor is that OpenAI wants to IPO soon, and they're facing a lot more financial uncertainty because whereas a year ago, there was significant confidence on Wall Street that all these AI companies would be able to meet their promises, now the picture isn't so clear because of Wall Street seeing the enormous amount of global backlash that is happening, and they're beginning to price that into their valuations. And the third reason that led OpenAI to shut this down is just flatlining consumer usage, which you could say is also a form of grassroots action. There's collective consumer action to just withhold the voting with their feet from these companies when they do not like what they're seeing and how they develop their products. And so remarkably, even though we have the world's first trillionaire and we have these extraordinarily imperial entities that seem ever powerful, they are being stumbled by the enormous and diverse resistance movements that are blossoming all around the world. And this is what has really shaped my own theory of change about where we should actually expect accountability from. I think in the past I would have said, I'm a journalist because I want to speak to policymakers because policymakers will eventually write regulation that holds these industries accountable. And as an American, I no longer find this path to be viable. But what we have seen in the last year is the grassroots, the bottoms up accountability, the bottoms up governance that is happening, all around the world, that is in fact forcing these companies to change tack, to spend enormous amounts of money to try and regain the narrative, to try and control elections. But in fact, they're still failing despite deploying those hundreds of millions in capital to do so. So that is where I see our continued role in making sure that we don't let the end times fascists have their way.
But are you still talking to your sources in OpenAI and other companies, and have their positions started to shift a little bit?
I don't talk to them as often as I did while I was working on the book, because I am trying to cool off a little bit. It's been really tough in this particular moment to keep sources safe because there's a lot more surveillance that's now happening on workers. There was this report from The Information that reveals that OpenAI has a internal version of ChatGPT that they now use to feed all of their internal documents into, and they use it to predict which employees are leaking information to the press every time there's stories coming out in the media. So I only speak to sources occasionally when I am not too worried about their safety. But one thing that's been interesting is I think there is this sort of it's hard to describe. Like, these employees are often some of the richest people in the world. Like, they're becoming multimillionaires through working at these companies. And yet when I speak with them, they have a similar profound loss of agency as I hear echoed from other people when they first encounter the empires, like taking their land and building these data centers and taking their data and so on, is they feel this loss of I don't actually know if there's anything that I can do to change the way that this trajectory is going, but many of them do feel now that there's something fundamentally wrong with this trajectory. And it's not just within OpenAI, it's within other companies as well. Like I was speaking with an employee at another competitor to OpenAI who was mentioning that he feels like so deeply listless from a day-to-day period, day-to-day, because ultimately he's building technologies that are going to replace him, because all of these companies are racing specifically to try to replace the AI researcher, because they think that this will be their competitive advantage. If they get a really good coding model that can accelerate AI research, then they will be able to go faster than the other company next to them. And he was like, I became an AI researcher because I find a lot of joy in this work, and now I'm just doing the very thing that's going to put me out of a job in a few years, and I can understand why like everyone else is so angry at us for doing this to every other profession as well, because I feel completely and utterly demotivated on a day-to-day now for like what I'm doing, but I think it might just be inevitable. Like it's just, yeah, so like that's kind of like the climate in a lot of these companies, is that the employees are taking their own medicine and they are feeling the same lack of empowerment that I heard from communities just a year ago. But what's interesting is, whereas these people at the center of power continue to feel that lack of agency, it's the people at the edges of empire that have now reclaimed their agency and are being, the loudest voices in actually realizing there's much work to be done to turn the ship around.
Karen, tell us about the AI Resist List.
Yeah, so I recently launched this project called the AI Resist List with a group of journalists, AI researchers, and critical scholars. There were a number of organizations that we partnered with. We and AI, a nonprofit in the UK, the Distributed AI Research Institute, which is led by Dr. Tani Gebru, and the Refugee Law Lab at York University. And this is a project that I started thinking about over a year ago when my book first came out, and I started going on book tour, and I was still really struggling with this question of like, what do we actually do in response to the empire? And I was encountering so many people in my audiences that were also asking this question, like, what can I individually do to take action? And I started wondering, like, how do I answer this question in a satisfying way that doesn't feel really cheap and kind of frivolous against these like extremely powerful forces? And so I started thinking, well, I'm sure there are many other people that have already answered this question, and they are already engaging in action all around the world to do this. And the reason why now I'm able to talk about all of these different movements is because we then engage on this kind of journalistic documentation project to figure out like, how are communities responding in like high agency, high conviction ways against the empire when they encounter it. And so we launched this website about a month ago that has around 30 different examples of resistance movements all around the world. And they span everything from like the artistic to the political, from the individual to the collective to the institutional. And this project has just been such a bright light in my life, because I've realized that there's so much that's happening already and so much more that can happen. One of my favorite examples that we documented is this community in Quilicura, Chile, that I write about in my book. And at the time, I wrote about them because they're one of the communities, they're a very working class community in the outskirts of Santiago. And they are being hammered with data centers. Like there's all these data centers that are trying to take a piece of the land in this community and then take their fresh water resources. And there is this very rich history of resistance in this community as well, because Chile has a very long colonial history of its own, and that blossomed a lot of different intersecting resistance movements to protect the environmental and natural resources of the country. And I went to write about them in my book because they were already engaging in some really vibrant grassroots organizing. After my book published, they went further and they created this, essentially a performance art project called Keely.ai, where they put up this website that you go to and it looks like a chatbot. And you can type into the chatbot just like you type into ChatGPT, but instead of it routing to an AI model, it routes to someone in the community. And so if you ask Keely.ai, hey, I would like a picture of a dog, it sends that query to their local artist named Benji, and then Benji takes out a piece of paper, draws a dog, snaps a picture, and sends it back to you. And they did this for, I think it was 16 hours or 24 hours, where they just invited anyone around the world to use Keely.ai. And it was their way of getting people to think critically about, first of all the frivolous things that they use chatbots for, and to make them say, like, hey, this doesn't have no cost. It actually has cost to communities like ours who host these data centers. And every time you ask a picture of whatever, you're drawing upon our freshwater resources, our energy, you're polluting our land. But also they wanted people to think about, like, why is it not that we're using these moments of having questions to, in fact, just reconnect with the people around us, with our own neighbors, our own community, and actually in that process build more resilience against exactly what the AI empires represent, this loss of community, this loss of solidarity, this loss of connectedness. And it went absolutely viral. And the mission that they kind of set out to do to inject this layer of provocative questioning into the narrative worked. And it's just like one of 30 examples that are absolutely delightful, that really chip away at all of the pillars of the empire. So the way that we actually organized the project is based on this other resist list that was the inspiration for our resist list. This is a resist list against authoritarianism in the US, and they introduced this idea that fighting something like an empire, fighting something like authoritarianism feels really intractable, because it just feels like the vast power chasm between the empire and you is just, it makes you feel powerless. But what they say is empires, authoritarianism, they're actually supported by pillars in society, very distinct pillars. And so the AI empire is supported by the data pillar, the labor pillar, the data center pillar, the mineral extraction pillar. And what we do is categorize all these resistance movements based on the pillar that it is chipping away at. And the idea is the more you erode each pillar, the more the entire structure begins to crumble.
Karen, thank you. I'm going to throw it open to the floor now. I'm sure we have some questions. Yes, lots of hands.
Hi. So my question requires some history knowledge and pop culture knowledge, so it's okay if you won't answer. So do you think that we are on the dawn of new Gilded Age? And second is, if you have seen, or anyone here from has seen, alien eras, in which corporations split up the world into zones of influence. Do you think that we are on the dawn of Gilded Age and the zone of influences of tech bros and AI as a zone of like empires, as in the title of this panel?
I would say that this is where my history knowledge is stretching a little bit, but I would say that the Gilded Age is probably a more limited metaphor, because my understanding of the Gilded Age was more like these companies within the U.S. that were carving up the U.S. or and engaging in kind of the same extravagant practices, but at a more contained scale. So that's why I reach back to empires as the metaphor, because it's happening at an extraordinarily global scale. And I'm talking about, the British East India Company more as the model, rather than like the Rockefellers as the model.
Hi. I loved your book. It was amazing. One thing that just stunned me in it a bit was this sort of revelation of just what a morally bankrupt person Sam Altman was. The sort of, just the level of dishonesty that comes through. which you've also seen a lot of recently in, court cases involving Mark Zuckerberg as well. I just wondered if you, had any thoughts on that. Did that sort of surprise you to discover the sort of, the real just moral bankruptcy there? I mean, you can understand, people being obsessed with AI and having a vision, but just to be so cynical in the, in the application of that vision. I just wondered if you had any comments. Yeah.
I was definitely surprised by that, but I was more surprised by I didn't really have a conception of Sam Altman before I started on the book. I'd heard lots of things from different, coverage that had already happened or from my sources that were quite divided on who he is as a character. And the thing that I was most surprised by is the degree to which people who had worked for him for a very long time and very closely with him still didn't quite know. They still had little confidence about what he actually stands for. That was the most shocking to me. I think every one of the tech elite, whether it's a Musk, Thiel, or whatever, they are all similar, but they have their own particular variation. And I think that is Altman's unique characteristic that I've just never heard anyone else described in that way. Like, he's a chameleon. He shapeshifts depending on who he's with, and therefore even someone that has worked with him like that closely cannot identify exactly what his values are. And I think that, to me, is the more unsettling thing.
Hi there. 2028 in America feels like quite a pivotal election in terms of, what may happen. And if hypothetically an AOC ticket was to run and, couldn't move into power, at this stage, could they bring back the power? Could they take control against your Thiels, your Altmans, your Musks? Just would like to know your view on that at this moment.
I think that there's this really interesting phenomenon happening right now in the U.S. where there is truly a new crop of political candidates that are beginning to win elections that are all running on the social democratic platform. Of course, Zoran Mamdani was the first example of this, but people had a genuine question of, is this just a New York City thing, or is this going to be a countrywide thing? And we are beginning to see, like the DC mayor is now going to be also of this camp. There's a Maine senator that is also going to be of this camp. There's a Seattle representative that is also from this camp. So there is this kind of wave of new politicians that are beginning to recognize that that the way that the country has divided itself in the past is not actually serving us well, and what's actually happening is essentially a vast class clash where we are minting the world's first trillionaire while the rest of Americans are struggling to put food on the table. And I do think that if we do see a wave of these elected officials come into power, that it will really start to shape and become a real lever of accountability again from the government level on these companies. So I'm pretty keen to see what's going to happen in the midterms. And of course, after the midterms, if that strategy works, then there will be more politicians running on this platform, more of them winning in the general presidential election. So yeah, I am hopeful that that can become quite a powerful mechanism.
Hi, I'm an attorney that sues tech companies and AI companies.
I love it.
Thank you. I'd love to hear your thoughts about a defense that I've been encountering recently. It's not been fully litigated yet, about how these platforms are entitled to the constitutional protection of their bots. So
Of their
bots. So XAI, in one of my cases, is claiming that Grok is totally entitled to notify people because Grok is entitled to human rights and civil rights and constitutional rights. It's expression of free speech.
Yeah, I obviously don't agree with this argument. I think what's been happening, and this is like a very clear example of this, is a critique that was identified back in the early days of the AI research landscape in like the 1960s. There's this MIT professor named Joseph Weizenbaum who was one of the original founding fathers of the research field, and he actually then turned on his own research fields because he realized back then that the way that his colleagues were obsessing over AI and talking about AI was a recipe for moral abscondment, basically, where political leaders and corporate leaders would be able to use AI as a way to just absolve themselves of any responsibility of their actions. And this kind of line of argument where people are saying, oh, these AI agents have somehow personhood like people and they should have rights as well, is exactly what he identified back in the 1960s, is literally trying to legally codify this idea that the person who designed the system is not the one to be held accountable, because now this chatbot itself is considered a separate person entity in the eyes of the law. And I just think that is, a deeply problematic and worrying trend, and like we should not be standing for that.
Thank you so much for engaging in interesting conversation. My question is about, you frequently address in your book and talks as well, this relationship between speed, scale up, and safety. And also recently I was also listening to a podcast, there was discussion about how Europe regulates versus how US innovates more. So I'm not a big fan of this type of like binary and the polarized approaches, because I think in that process we might lose a sight of more maybe balanced approach. So am I too naive, or maybe realistically, is there a possibility of innovate safely approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I similarly feel the way that you do about this phrase, Europe regulates, the US innovates. I think that is absolutely extremely reductive of what's actually happening. Throughout innovation and technology history, we need regulation to actually help with innovation in service of people and of the planet. And, you know, the classic example that illustrates this is seatbelt regulation. That was what actually allowed the safe adoption of cars and then transformed the economy. Not always in great ways, but I think that one of the challenges that Europe faces right now is not actually that they are regulating a lot. It's that they also do not have a particular vision that they're rallying around for what innovation looks like. Like, I do think that there needs to be a complement between the two, where you know what you're fighting against and you're regulating against that, but you also need to know what you're fighting for. Like, what is the vision, what is the future we are building? Because regulation is reactive, you know, it's been a response thus far to the vision that Silicon Valley has presented us. But given that we do not like that vision, then what's next? What kinds of AI systems, what kinds of other technology, how do we redesign AI so that it actually serves us? Because AI is ultimately a collection of many, many different technologies. Right now, we're in this information vortex where everyone thinks AI is just the large-scale chatbot generative system that is deeply harmful in all these different ways. But, you know, for decades, AI meant actually just specialized systems that target things like helping detect whether or not a medical image has cancer, or helping accelerate drug discovery by calculating different molecular compounds and the way that they interact with the human body. And so I think Europe needs to put, and I tell European policymakers this all the time, there needs to be some kind of strong articulation of the kinds of AI systems that we actually want and the kind of future that we actually want to build.
Hello, my name is Anfisa. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. I want to ask you, how hard was actually to ensure safety for all the people who talked to you? And also, how can we all create these safe spaces for people to speak up? Because these empires, they have all the money, all the power, zero consequences to all they do, and people are afraid to speak up. So, yeah, thank you.
It's a great question. So in my case, what I did was, of course, I always spoke to my sources on encrypted platforms, and I also I went a bit extreme, and I actually didn't even use a single AI transcription tool during the part of my book reporting process. So I manually transcribed all of my interviews because I was very nervous about uploading their interviews to cloud-based services where I didn't actually know where their data would travel, and of course, my sources were nervous about that as well. And then what I would do is go back, like give every single person a call back after I finished writing the manuscript and knew exactly where their information would appear in the book and like which part of it and in the context of what other information. And I very carefully walked them through bullet point by bullet point exactly what they had told me and the context and how it appears so that they could tell me whether or not, a certain constellation of facts would identify them, or whether putting it next to another piece of context would identify them. Or I would also check exactly how I identified them anonymously in the book. Like some people I would simply identify as AI researcher, other people they felt comfortable with me identifying the team that they were on, so on and so forth. But I was like really, really, really cautious in that regard. And as far as I know, none of my sources have had their safety jeopardized or been identified in any way. But this is one of the challenges increasingly that journalists face, is that it is quite hard sometimes to get employees to take that leap of faith and put their trust in a journalist, that they will be kept totally anonymous. And there have been some really interesting initiatives that have come out lately that try to help facilitate more of this whistleblowing. One of them is from this organization called PST and PSST. And what they did is they created this secure Dropbox where you upload information in an encrypted way, but they don't use it until two people have independently uploaded the same information, because part of the risk to the source is that they're identifiable simply based on their access to a piece of information, because there are very, very few people that might know that. And so it's already more safety in numbers when two people have come forward or three people or more. So they're kind of experimenting with this model of, can we actually give people that safe space to come forward by simply telling them, actually, there are two of you or there are three of you now that are willing to take the risk together, but you don't know each other. So so there's like some interesting endeavors like that are ongoing that I think we can continue thinking about as a journalistic community. It's like, how do we continue to create more of those types of spaces?
We are at the end of our time for today, so I'm not taking any more questions. Before we leave, Karen, I just wanted to say thank you from a personal level. Your reporting has had a profound impact on my editing and the way that I approach this story, which is the single most important story of our time. So thank you, and thank you for sharing all your insight with us today.
Thank you. And thank you so much all for being here.